Today, we're going to talk about one of the most staggering economic reversals in all of modern history. It's the story of how a global superpower, a nation that once held a huge piece of the world's wealth, was basically systematically taken apart. To really get a sense of the scale here, we have to start with this one number. In the year 1700, India's share of the entire world economy was 27%. I mean, think about that. That was bigger than all of Europe's economies combined. Okay, now let's fast forward a little over 2 centuries to 1947. This is the year India finally gets its independence. By that point, its share of the world economy had just cratered. It was less than 3%. A drop that catastrophic just begs the question, what on earth happened, right? How does a global economic powerhouse fall that far, that fast? Well, that's the puzzle we're going to piece together today. So first things first, we need to understand what India was like before all of this. It wasn't some sleepy agricultural backwater. No, it was a global manufacturing hub. People literally called it the world's workshop. And look, this isn't just some modern take on history. Even back in the 19th century, an American scholar, J.T. Sunderland, described the India the British foresaw as a manufacturing giant, bigger and more advanced than any nation in Europe or even the rest of Asia. Its economy basically stood on these three massive pillars. First up, textiles. India controlled a mind-blowing 25% of the entire global textile trade. Then you had shipbuilding. It was an absolute behemoth of an industry. And finally, high-quality steel. They pioneered the stuff that became famous on the West as Wootz or Damascus steel. And we're not just talking about quantity here. The quality of this manufacturing was just incredible. Take shipbuilding. You can look at contracts from the time that show Bengali-built ships were considered models of fine workmanship. They had a lifespan of over 20 years. That's almost double what English-built ships could manage. So, you see, India wasn't just a rich nation. It was a direct manufacturing competitor. And its economic decline, well, it wasn't an accident. It was a story of deliberate, systematic deindustrialization. Let's dig into exactly how they did it. If you wanted to take down India's biggest industry, textiles, there was a brutal four-step playbook. Step 1. The British East India Company created a monopoly, cutting Indian merchants off from their own customers around the world. Step 2. They stopped paying for Indian goods with British money and started using the tax money they collected from Indians, which just destroyed the prices. Step 3 was pure physical violence, smashing looms and, according to many historical accounts, even maiming weavers. And the final nail in the coffin? A massive 80% tariff that made it literally impossible to export whatever was left. And, you don't even have to read between the lines. British officials themselves were often shockingly honest about why they were doing this. This quote just lays it all out there. The point was never to help India, it was to turn it into a captive market for British stuff. And the result of all this? Absolutely devastating. By 1947, after being a manufacturing hub for centuries, less than 1%, just 0.7% of the Indian workforce was in industry. Millions of skilled craftspeople, merchants, and shipbuilders had nowhere to turn except back to farming. So, with the manufacturing sector totally wiped out and most of the population forced onto farmland, the whole game shifted. The next phase was all about extraction, about bleeding the country dry through agriculture and just crippling taxes. The change in taxes was just staggering. Under previous rulers, like the Mughals, taxes on farm income were, maybe around 15%, while the British jacked that rate up to between 50 and 80%. They more than tripled the burden on farmers. And if you couldn't pay, well, the enforcement was merciless. People who fell behind faced these horrific punishments, being locked in cages out in the sun, physical torture, and having their land taken away. For the first time in India's history, this created a massive class of peasants who owned no land at all. And again, this wasn't some rogue governor. This is coming from the top. The language used by the British leadership itself is so revealing. I mean, here you have a Prime Minister of the UK, the Marquis of Salisbury, comparing India to a body that needs to be bled of its money. It's just a chillingly direct admission of what they were doing. So what was the grand total? The price tag for all of this? Well, while an exact number is pretty much impossible to calculate, modern economists who studied the trade data and capital flight put the total wealth drained from India at somewhere around $43 trillion in today's money. Now, okay, people who defend colonial rule often point to one big thing as a gift: the railways. But was it really a gift? Or was it something else entirely? Let's take a look at this railway myth and the incredible human cost that went along with it. This is the question that always comes up, right? It's the number one argument used to say that, hey, colonialism wasn't all bad. But when you actually look at how and why those railways were built, a very different story starts to emerge. The truth is, the railways were not a gift. They were basically a British investment scheme. Profits were guaranteed for British shareholders. And who paid for it all? Indian taxpayers. They were built incredibly inefficiently, with all the good materials and all the high-paying engineering jobs going straight to Britain. And their main purpose was simple: to get India's raw materials out of the country faster. And while this supposed gift was being constructed, here's the reality happening on the ground. An estimated 35 million people died in India from totally preventable famines under British rule. To put that number in perspective, that is more deaths than under Stalin or Mao, and it's 5 times the number of victims in the Holocaust. This quote from a doctor at the time really gets to the core of why these famines were so unbelievably deadly. See, the problem wasn't a lack of food. In fact, those new railways were being used to export enormous amounts of grain out of India, even during the worst droughts. The real problem was that British policies had made the people so poor they literally couldn't afford to buy the food that was growing all around them. So when you pull all of these pieces together, from the deindustrialization to the crushing taxes to the truth about the railways, one crystal clear conclusion emerges about what British rule in India was really all about. Look, previous invaders like the Mughals, they certainly weren't angels, but there was a fundamental difference. While they came from somewhere else, they made India their new home. India's wealth, for the most part, actually stayed in India. The British were different. They ruled India like it was a temporary foreign outpost, and their main goal, their whole purpose, was to extract its wealth and ship it back home. That is the very definition of an extractive colony. And that brings us right up to our final thought. Since India gained its independence over 70 years ago, it has not had a single major famine. Not one, which is an incredible testament to self-rule. But it also leaves us with this huge, profound question. When a nation's entire economy, its industries, its institutions, when they have been so completely unmade, what does it truly take to heal and rebuild from that?